Well, good morning to our viewers here in the United States and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Rob Fenstermacher. I'm the Chief Content Officer at the American Council on Germany, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's Kaffeepause, What's a Buzz in Berlin. I'm sitting in today for Steve Sokol, who is normally doing our Kaffeepause. He's in Berlin this week attending our annual American-German Young Leaders Conference, which is taking place again finally after 2 years due to COVID. We're really excited that the American Council on Germany is back to doing all of our in-person programming, but we're also happy that we're still doing our virtual programming, such as events like this morning. Rather than What's a Buzz in Berlin, I probably should have said What's a Buzz in Munich, because this morning we're joined today by Josh Galou, who is the editor, Global Business Europe at Bloomberg and is based in Munich. So welcome to you, Josh. It's wonderful that you're with us this morning. I know we've been trying to get you, and I'm glad that this morning we finally managed to get you to one of our Kaffeepause.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So Josh has worked for Bloomberg for over 15 years, serving in a variety of positions, including White House editor, where he was most recently before moving back to Munich. He was money and influence editor and financial crimes editor, amongst many other positions. You can find out more about his background in the chat. And as I said, I'm just really pleased that we're able to have him join our Kaffeepause network amongst the many German and American journalists that we've had join us over the past year and a half or 2 years, I guess, at this point. Given Josh's focus on economic issues, I thought we would focus today much of our conversation on the range of economic issues that are confronting Germany. And unfortunately, there are quite a few at the moment. But before I begin, as a reminder to everybody, if you have a question, please post it in the chat, or you can also post it in the Q&A. And I will try and weave that into the discussion as we go along. So as many people probably saw last week, in May, there was the news that Europe's biggest economy imported more than it exported for the first time in 3 decades, which broke Germany's winning streak as export Weltmeister, or global export champion, since the country's reunification back in 1991. So Josh, I thought we'd start off with that, because that is obviously a huge piece of news. You know, for 30 years, Germany has really been, a leader in the field of exports. Can you talk to us a little bit more about, what caused this shift? And is this something that, you expect is going to continue now for a while, or is this a temporary blip because of all of the different issues that has sort of been buffeting Germany, whether it's been COVID or now the war in Ukraine?
Well, it's a big question, and it does get right to the core of what the country's facing. And that moment in May that they reported their first trade deficit in 30 years, it felt very symbolic of the moment, right? That you have Chancellor Scholz talking about this Zeitenwende, like a paradigm shift in what's going on in Germany, multiple pressures, as you said, coming off of COVID, then the situation in Ukraine and their dependency on Russia. There's massive inflation happening. There are a lot of different pressures happening right now. So the moment feels like it isn't necessarily a blip, because the things that appear to be driving the trade deficit were high costs, right? So German goods, as you said, tons of brands that are recognized globally for high quality, made in Germany. The cost is just getting too high, and that's mainly from inputs like energy. It has also to do, there's a bit of a data effect with the sanctions against Russia, because so many companies were pulling out of selling their goods in Russia. I think that the exports to Russia dropped by like 50% or something. That's a pretty significant market for German goods. So that is perhaps a blip, but there are longer term pressures on German manufacturing, German production in general, that aren't going to go away so quickly, right? The energy is the biggest one. And that's just sort of, we're literally right in the middle of a totally uncertain time about what's going to happen. And I know you want to talk more in detail about that later, but if you just take that as one of the main data points of what's pushing up costs, Germany already has relatively high labor costs compared to other countries. Its biggest export market is the United States, of course, which is also under pressures, inflationary and otherwise. So, it's hard to look. The German industry is robust, and it has been for a very long time. And you see you already see the country functioning differently than others, even the way they're tackling energy, they're tackling and thinking about inflation and how to tackle that. You do still see a fair amount of solidarity, I think, socially about the headwinds and that it's going to be a tough time. But, it is hard to say, it's hard to imagine that industry would come out of this current crisis unchanged. There are a lot of factors right now that even other European countries aren't facing to the same degree that Germany is. So, even a German company, say BASF, right, massive chemical manufacturer, they have their factory in Ludwigshafen, and that's where they get basically a direct line of Russian gas, right? If they can't continue to operate that factory, they can move production to, maybe not entirely, but they can shift a lot of their production to a factory they have in Belgium. And there's sort of a net zero effect there broadly, but not for Germany, right? That there's tens of thousands of jobs. So the risk of sort of real structural change is great. And when that happens, you can think of, I guess, the decline in exports or the relationship there, the trade deficit, as not necessarily a temporary situation.
Yeah. So one of our board members actually posted a question in the Q&A that I also had as well. And he just indicated, but the euro is down. And I wanted to ask that question because generally, if the euro is down, that should help with its exports. And you mentioned the United States is obviously one of the biggest markets. Americans are loving going to Germany right now because it's so cheap. So, should that not be helping a little bit? And I guess kind of related to that, as you mentioned, obviously has disappeared, if you will. Are there opportunities for Germany to find other markets, to help make up perhaps for that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know, honestly. I mean, yes, of course. So on the first point on the euro, absolutely. I think that must help soften the blow a little bit on the export side, taking a little bit of the sting out of it. But, the amount that the euro has weakened, even just vis-a-vis the dollar, it is just a fraction of the increase they've seen in energy costs. So I think typically and theoretically, the exchange rate plays a pretty important role there and can affect and it does affect the real price of those goods. But I think the most simple analysis I would give is just that it is the energy prices have gone 10 times as high as they've been. And I think the euro and the dollar are basically on parity right now, or roughly so.
Very close.
Yeah, and that obviously is extremely weak for the euro. I don't know where it was a year ago. I want to say 130, 120, maybe somewhere around there.
I think it was 110, 115, but it was still
okay.
A huge shift. It's moving towards parity.
Okay. Still a big shift, but yeah, I guess it's just not enough to offset the input costs and all the different supply chain pressures that there are in terms of what German goods are composed of, right? Whether it's cars and all the chips that are not there, or electronics, or appliances, things like that. They're just not. Their orders are backlogged.
Yeah. So I wanted to pick up, you talked about the Zeitenwende, and that was another question I kind of put on here is, we obviously keep hearing about the Zeitenwende in Germany, which has generally been referring more to Germany's need to come up with a new defense and security policy. But I think you were going in this direction, economically speaking. Is this the end of this winning streak kind of a sign that this is also a Zeitenwende and a turning point for the German economy? Because, the era of globalization that we've been living in and just in time supply chains, the cheap energy from Russia, those are all things that have changed and are likely not going to come back anytime soon, and not likely to allow Germany to return to the way things were prior to the pandemic. So, can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, how do you see Germany kind of transitioning to deal with these changes, and what's the impact going to be, especially on the Mittelstand, that really is the driver of the German economy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's sort of the heart of what nobody knows right now, right? There's, yes, I do think it is either a paradigm shift or there's just extreme pressure on the model right now. There was a week ago, Scholz convened sort of for the first time, the government kind of convened the various players, representative of employers, the unions, to talk about wage negotiations, et cetera. It caused quite a stir here, right? Because the government constitutionally can sort of advise, but is not meant to take a direct role in negotiating what happens with wages. But the problem is and that has worked great for a long time. The problem right now is that, and it could continue to work, just putting it out there, but the pressures are great and they're very complicated. So even within industries, say within the chemical industry, you have this fracturing, and you also see in the automobile industry, you have this fracturing of interests. Right, and that always happens in a moment of crisis. But what you see is that the needs of BASF are different from the needs of maybe a small chemical maker, and they no longer want to be represented in the associations. That's already happened in the Automobile Association, that some of the car makers are sort of splintering off and making their own case. But in terms of the model, right, of the sort of corporate social model of determining wages. The issue here that the government sees is there are massive inflationary pressures right now, right? So if you, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but that's what is coming to mind for me, right? One of the core issues here is inflation, and there are questions out there about the efficacy of monetary policy to tame inflation, which is effectively driven by energy, food prices, and things like that, not necessarily excessive borrowing and spending. So how do you address it? Well, there's you want to avoid this sort of wage price spiral. And many of the things that the government is trying to push are sort of one-off payments, one-off increases or maybe tax breaks, things like that would help damp the effect of these energy prices, but not necessarily embed sort of high sticky wages that won't come back down and driving that kind of spiraling price increase, particularly when you're faced with a potential recession or likely recession.
But the unions clearly don't want that, right? I mean, the unions are going to push in the other direction and say, you need to be raising wages at the same rate, or at least close to the same rate as inflation, to try and deal with that, and that these one-offs aren't going to work, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. And also they're pointing to, if you, again, not to keep picking on BASF, but they were posting record profits at the beginning of this year, right? So it oftentimes comes back down to who's going to pay for this, right? Is it going to be the firms? Is it going to be the middle class, the people who, are getting hit the hardest by energy price increases, right? It's very likely that people are going to see their heating bills just skyrocket. It's hard to avoid. But in terms of what the unions want, they obviously want what's best for the workers. They sit on the boards, they have some transparency into what is in the corporate books and what the company can pay, what it's seeing, what it's dealing with. So obviously they're pushing for that. And, they don't, thus far from what I've heard, I did hear one union sort of express some concern about jobs leaving. And then others sort of blowing it off as like, yeah, this is typical, threats from industry that they'll take, that they'll move. So I don't know. It's a very tense time for those talks.
Do you think those talks coming, because this was something that was modeled on, if I remember correctly, something that was set up in 1967, sort of when the Wirtschaftswunder sputtered a bit and started to suffer a recession in Germany. And I can't recall how successful that was back then, but is this model going to actually work that the Social Democrats seem to like, but a lot of others may not be in favor of?
I don't know. I think a lot of this is really going to be political. There's a lot of talk about the Schuldenbremse, right? And you have Scholz trying to pull this line of giving these one-off payments, and then on the other hand, you have Lindner, the finance minister, saying that he's ready to cut long-term unemployment benefits, and they want to be under 60% GDP debt next year. So there are some competing realities, that not all of these things can happen. And I don't, your guess is as good as mine on the impact of this socially, right? Like there will be, you can imagine if people get slammed with bills like that, that it's going to really inflame a broad swath of society, and it would be bad.
Yeah, of course. So before I move on, because I did want to start touching on some of the energy issues, which obviously is the core of a lot of the challenges economically that Germany's facing. But I did have another question from another board member who wrote, Germany in recent weeks has signaled a realization that more fiscal spending is needed to cushion consumers and some industries from the impact of higher energy prices. Do you see this fiscal expansion being material enough to ward off a German recession should energy woes continue to hurt the economy?
Maybe. It depends on the woes, right? It depends on how bad, it depends on how much they do and how bad the gas situation gets, right? And honestly, and I'm not an economist, but I would be awfully surprised if Germany doesn't have a recession. I would be shocked, in fact. I mean, the all signs point towards a contraction. The question, people are talking about double-digit percentage contractions if the gas shortage becomes more acute, right? If the pipes don't get turned back on after this Nord Stream maintenance, if they have to go to that third emergency plan level of rationing gas. By law, they have to have, supplies, I think 80% of their reserves filled by November or October, and 90% in November. Mm-hmm. It just, on their current flow rates, it's just not even close to happening. So, if it gets into a situation of rationing, it's very hard to imagine a scenario where the economy isn't contracting significantly, right? Because obviously by law, the gas will go first towards heating homes, towards making sure hospitals and obviously like any critical infrastructure is dealt with. If you're a large company that's working on gas, you can't just switch to coal. You can't just switch. You can't just switch an apartment to electric heating. Electric heaters are all sold out.
Right.
But honestly, the substitutability of energy is a real issue. And while I think the fiscal spending will be great, and I don't think that great in terms of amount, I think it will soften the blow, but I just can't. It's hard for me to contemplate a situation where it's not in a significant recession.
The sense I think we've been hearing from some of our other events, that's clearly the direction that Germany's headed. But you touched on, and we'll move now into the sort of the gas and energy shortage aspect. You touched on the fact that there's this obviously growing fear that Germany's gas shortage is going to worsen significantly in the fall. And Klaus Müller, who's the head of the German energy regulator, I think has said that if Russian gas were to stop, the current stocks would only last for 1 or 2 months. And you touched on this as well already. Over the weekend, Nord Stream 1, which is one of the key pipelines bringing Russian gas into Germany, was shut down temporarily, supposedly now for maintenance. There's, of course, concerns that if it doesn't get turned on quickly by Putin, perhaps because he wants to put more pressure on Germany and Europe, that the issue will really come to a head pretty quickly here. So, how likely do you think it is? I know you're not a politician, but, how likely is it that the maintenance is going to be prolonged? And sort of this whole Nord Stream 1 maintenance issue also has had a transatlantic element that has involved Canada and the issue of the turbine being provided. And I'm curious if you could mention a little bit about that issue and that topic to folks on the call.
Sure. So, just the basic context there is that a few weeks ago, a turbine that is part of Nord Stream, the Nord Stream pipeline, was in Canada for repairs, and because of the sanctions regime, it was held there and was not returned to Russia, where the turbine actually lives and works. And as a result, when that kicked in, Russia used that as a reason to decrease the flow of gas in the Nord Stream pipeline by 60%, which is quite dramatic. And most people say, obviously, that turbine was not critical for that much of the gas flow. But in any case, that is the turbine has been sort of the crux, of it's become this sort of hostage-like figure in this debate. And Germany then last week, I believe, Habeck has been putting pressure on them. Germany last week arranged for Canada to then ship it to Germany instead of shipping it directly to Russia in order to get around the sanctions laws. And the hope is that, when this turbine is returned, that Putin will see fit to return Nord Stream to its normal flow and output. I think without the turbine, the odds were very, very low. The expectations were high that he would use that to keep the pipeline turned off after the regular maintenance was scheduled to end, which would be really dramatic. Now that the turbine is set to return to Russia, I think the optimistic view is that now everything's fine with Nord Stream. It's doubtful that it's that simple, but I think the odds have gone up slightly. The thing is that none of this, just like the original invasion of Ukraine, right? It's hard to impose sort of a rational frame of thinking to this, because not all of it is rational, even among, even if you take the different players and their interests, economic or political, into account, it's just not always coming out as what one would expect. So people are really, my sense here is that the people are generally pretty anxious about the situation. Robert Habeck, Vice Chancellor, Economy Minister, Energy Minister, Climate Minister, Super Minister, he has for several weeks, I think he's gotten very good marks, publicly for the way he's handled the situation. He's been pretty, from the get-go, he's been pretty frank about the risks that this poses to the German economy, the limited menu of options that Germany has to actually affect change. You just can't. You just can't change your energy sources overnight. Right. And, look, they have, even if gas gets cut off, as you were mentioning, Klaus Müller was saying, the issue, they have obviously been doing a lot of diplomatic work to secure other sources of energy. They've been, working to get access to LNG ports in France and Belgium and other countries. They get oil from Norway. They are building an LNG facility in the northern part of the country, but that is not meant to come online until December at the earliest. So that's well into the heating season, and it's not enough to make up for the flow of gas that was coming from Russia. So it's a very complicated picture. The law they passed the Energy Security Act last week.
That was the next thing I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
You led into that very nicely, was, that on Friday or Thursday of last week, they passed this new Energy Security Act, which one was supposed to help do bailout measures for companies and such that are being impacted on this, but has also extended use of coal plants, correct?
Right. Yeah.
So, that's obviously one measure they're going, but I kind of wanted to transition in that also had an impact, or as a result of that Energy Act, it was an announcement by Uniper, which is the largest supplier of natural gas in Germany, immediately for a bailout, and they're talking about billions. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about who Uniper is, because I'm guessing a lot of Americans, at least on the call, may never have heard of Uniper and understand what their role is. I've heard comparisons to AIG, when we had the financial crisis, that if they were to fail, then the whole energy industry in Germany could fail. But could you tell us a little bit more about that, and why are they in fact in need of a bailout?
Well, effectively what Uniper does is they serve as sort of an intermediary in the market, and they essentially get the Russian gas to the consumers of Russian gas, right? So they are delivering that gas to municipalities, to factories. It's a pretty critical role, right? Now, I actually can't speak to what role they perform in the market in terms of, like the energy markets are super complex in terms of contracts and expiry and who is holding what risk. But I think the simplest way to think about that is, they are buying gas. They're having to buy substitute energy for the Russian gas that is not coming in to supply to German factories and municipalities. And that gas in the spot market is just, it's 10 times higher than what they are able to charge their customers, right? Because their customers have contracts that are from 2020, 2021, longstanding futures contracts that secure the price of their energy. And as it stands, Uniper is basically having to absorb that cost, right? They're having to buy it at those high rates and sell it at the previously agreed to rates. So they're losing tens of millions of dollars a day. As you said, they've asked the German government for a bailout, and they estimate that they would need upwards of 9 billion euros, which is more than twice their market value. Their stock has declined, 75% this year or something. they are also they're very close to securing this. I mean, the German government has said we're not going to let Uniper fail, right? We're not going to let it happen. Habeck has sort of referred to this Lehman Brothers-like moment that could happen if you allow a systemically relevant company to fail in the energy markets.
There's a cascading effect, right?
Yeah, this cascading effect. So the discussions are ongoing. They've been going on for a couple of weeks. And I think the main holdup is that the Finnish government is a majority holder of Uniper. They own over 50% of the company. And Uniper, not Uniper, the German government is sort of leaning on Finland to provide a little bit more money to help solve this situation. And Finland is not very receptive to that. They provided, I believe, an 8 billion euro credit facility at the beginning of this year, which has basically been used up. Germany has a $2 billion credit facility through the KfW that it gave to Uniper, but that's also running dry. So what looks most probable, I don't know what's going on behind the doors with Germany and Finland, but it looks like Germany will take some form of equity stake in the company. Like, I think the company has asked for at least 10%, and also an additional credit, a line of credit to get them through. And I think they also want to seek some sort of compensation for damages from Germany and also from Russia for the disruptions that have basically brought them down. But they're in pretty bad shape in terms of liquidity. They just can't continue to take those kinds of losses.
Are there concerns that Uniper is just the beginning? I mean, I understand that what we were just saying is you don't want that cascading effect, but are there other firms out there that you see on the horizon as a result of this that may also now, because of this new Energy Security Act, be saying, hey, we're also going to need bailouts? And how willing or how much money do you think the German government's going to be willing to start dedicating to this?
It's a great question, and I don't. I know there's a company, VGN, which provides a similar role. There are sort of stories starting to emerge that they might be in a similar position. But I only know that from what I've read. I don't have any personal knowledge of that. So in case anybody on this call is like trying to short VGN, no, I think you're going to start seeing these companies come out of the woodwork now, right? And similar to what we were talking about at the very beginning of our discussion, this crisis is creating this sort of splintering effect within industries, right? Where maybe the needs of maybe people see Uniper getting bailed out and they're like, hey, we need some of that as well. We're going down as well. And, what we've learned, if the financial crisis is in any way some kind of, teachable moment for this, it's that it's very hard to oftentimes understand the connectivity of all these different businesses and what the cascading effect, how big it might be.
Right. So I missed a question that came in again from another board member of the ACG asking who finances Uniper now and why shouldn't they suffer?
Oh, it's a good question. They're a public company, so they're financed in public debt markets, but they do function sort of as a utility, right? So the Finnish government, the parent company of Uniper is the Finnish Fortum, I think is the name of it, the Finnish gas supplier. And that is, I think, a very fair question. Why it is? Well, first of all, they are suffering. So I think the question is, who else is going to suffer from their demise if they're allowed to suffer? And is that something that the society or can tolerate? I think clearly the view of the government is that the economy can't tolerate it. The energy markets can't tolerate it. But certainly no apologist for bailouts, but if the government should have a relatively strong hand in setting terms for a bailout where it doesn't just shovel taxpayer money into a failing firm to prop it up and pay executives enormous sums or something like that. But that's always a risk. And honestly, I think it's just that given the energy situation, that firm is just right in the middle, holding the bag. And I don't know. There's always moral hazard. There's difficulty to assess like what would be the outcome if they were to fall. But I think I think the company is suffering. Yeah.
It sounds like you're saying, as the case has been made in the past, it's a linchpin company that could have ramifications on others. So I'm going to combine kind of two questions and then move on to something else. But we've been talking a lot about, other energy sources, given the fact that they need to find alternatives to Russian gas. And some questions have come in again, and it's been a regular refrain, I think, in many of our sessions, especially from Americans, asking if there's any chance that nuclear power is going to be reassessed. And I'm not sure if this recent Energy Security Act actually closed the door on that finally and said, no, we're not going to do that. But maybe a question about nuclear power. And someone else asked, what is the feasibility, or is Germany thinking about potentially importing gas from other countries such as Venezuela or Iran? But that also poses issues given secondary sanctions from the US, right?
Right.
Either of those?
So I have not heard much discussion. I did early on in, maybe in March, started to hear discussions about Venezuela and Iran that has not really come back into the dialogue as far as I've heard. I think that was sort of written off, although there were calls for Venezuela certainly to increase its production, and its input into global oil markets when there was price pressure there. But since then, I have not heard discussion about that as sort of new sources for Germany. What I have heard is sort of importing, fracking gas that gets fracked in the US. There's even discussion about fracking in Germany, which again is not something that would happen overnight. But even I think most people on this call would also say, wow, that's a big deal for Germany to think about fracking, just because of the environmental questions around it.
And there's been such huge opposition. I mean, when the United States started doing it, sort of the outcry of how
exactly. Yeah, and crazy things happening around it, right? It doesn't come without risk by any stretch. And I think it was a big. It was a big decision in the energy law to restart these mothballed coal-fired power plants. That's a hard pill to swallow, especially for a green economy minister, and that might be part of the political fortunes here, is that since he's a Green Party member, Habeck, it does make it more politically feasible for when he says it that we have to do this. But as for nuclear, that has come up, but there are a couple of problems. One is that this sort of getting out of nuclear is a very complicated and organized process. And it's not like a coal-fired plant where you can just turn the switch back on, throw in some coal, and off you go. There's just a different process that I'm obviously unable to explain, but my understanding is that you can't just refire these nuclear plants. And whether they would come, and also the uranium rods, I think they use, many of them come from Russia. So that's sort of yet another problem with doing that. But as for whether nuclear would become would be rethought on a longer term basis, to be reintegrated as a form of Germany's energy plans, it's hard to assess, honestly. Like there is talk. It's hard to sort out the interests, but I don't see a lot of appetite for it, honestly. I don't see a lot of appetite for it, but maybe it depends how the winter goes and how if things here really retire. But those are things that you don't build one overnight, right? So you can't just set one up and then get through the winter.
So that actually poses a little bit of a good transition to my next question, which is, one way you can deal with an energy crisis is to try and reduce your use of energy, right? Mm-hmm. Not keep trying to find new sources of energy. And over the weekend, I read a few articles that were talking about how landlords are now raising their heating prices to their tenants by 100%. But there are landlords who are now going to reduce, the amount of hot water that people are going to be getting, in their apartments. So my question kind of goes to, one, do you think, is your sense that those measures can really have an impact? But, how are people reacting to that? Because that really starts to impact people's lives. And you touched on the fact that as these pressures get higher, there's going to be more and more pressure on politicians, potential social unrest, right? I can't imagine that politicians aren't concerned about parties like the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, trying to turn this as an advantage to them against the parties. So, and I kind of also like this question simply because you're not in Berlin, you're not in the Berlin bubble, you're down in Munich. So I'm curious, what is your perception of how are Germans dealing with these new restrictions, if you will? And what's the stamina going to be to keep doing these measures as things move forward?
Yeah, no, good question. I think that, well, first, you don't see visible restrictions like everything sort of pales in comparison to coronavirus, right? Where it's utterly visible, empty towns and quarantining. You don't pick up on this.
You don't have days when you can get gas or not, like we had during the energy crisis of the 70s.
Correct. No, we don't. That's not happening at this point. We could be close to that if the pipeline doesn't turn back on. But honestly, my understanding is that saving energy obviously is fantastic for people to do. It's important. I sense a fair amount of solidarity around that. I don't think people are, moaning about that kind of thing. People are anxious about what's ahead, right? And I think they're quite happy to take I'm speaking in like massive generalities here, but my sense is like socially there's not a lot of griping about this. I mean, there has been from the AfD in Parliament already, but broadly speaking, I haven't heard that. Whether or not it has an impact, I don't know. I think broadly speaking, it's just a drop in the well when it comes, like those sorts of measures, while laudable and excellent, they are not going to solve the crisis, right? Like they might help, and maybe the key way is to think of it more in terms of like, segmented, right, into the ability, the impact of saving and conserving energy, right, at the private level, is that will have an impact on cost. It will have an impact on inflation. It can help in many ways. Does it solve the country's overall macroeconomic energy needs? No. I mean,
it may create a sense of solidarity in some sense.
Right. I think it has an important political function, like you say. Yeah.
So we're close to the end, but if I can ask you one more question, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I don't mean any pun by that, but I know you've written a lot about the German auto industry. They have been, hit by all sorts of different issues. Obviously, all the issues that we've discussed today. They've also been impacted by the supply chain and chip shortage issues. as well as just trying to deal with the transition away from the combustion engine to electric. I just wondered if maybe we could wrap up with getting a sense of how is that industry faring, given how important it is. It's 800,000 jobs, it's 5% of GDP. If they start having challenges, given all this, it's also going to have a huge impact on the German economy.
Absolutely. Sort of like the energy situation, they're just under an immense moment. They're at a huge inflection point. And it's not clear how they're going to fare. I think that they all project optimism, of course, but I think there's good reason for that. There's been a huge amount of demand for cars. The problem has been the supply chains, the lack of semiconductors, and of course, because of the war, there have been other supply chain disruptions because of COVID. There were other factory closures. So, it's not. I think they are under an immense amount of stress, right? Because up to now, it's been sort of a logistics operation. You need to get your supply chain sorted. You need to figure out how you're going to develop software to catch up with Tesla. You need to figure out how to source batteries and reinvent your factories, right, to produce electric vehicles, and how quickly you can do that. And now it's a little bit different, right? They have a backlog of orders, which is great, right? So demand is still there. It's more an issue of producing enough to meet the demand. But that is surely going to change with a massive economic contraction. And I'm not saying there definitely will be one, but as I said at the beginning, it doesn't look great, right? And so they are facing the same problems as other industries, right? Like inflation, raw material costs, supply chain problems. And there's really a lot of uncertainty here right now.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that was a little bit of a pessimistic end.
Yeah, sorry.
But it was still a great conversation. We really covered a range of issues, a lot of ground over the last 45 minutes or so. I want to thank you again for joining us for today, and for all our viewers, and for the great questions that we got that came in. I thought it was a great conversation, and I hope we'll be able to get you back in a few months. Hopefully it won't be as pessimistic or as worrisome as just today, but it would be great to do a follow-up later in the year with you. So thank you very much, and Auf Wiedersehen, and have a great rest of the day. I guess it's late afternoon for you.
Yeah, it's getting there. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Yep, thanks a lot. See you all later. Bye-bye. Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye.